All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. This week, I wanted to talk about fandom. And if you tuned in last week, you heard the segment about the Olympics, the Olympic basketball tournament that's coming up. And obviously, the U.S. is incredibly favored in these upcoming Olympics, as they usually are in most Olympics. You know, it's the sport that we have been dominant in here in America for a very long time. Obviously, there are competitors: France, Germany, Spain, Greece, all these other countries, Serbia. But we are still here in the US as the overwhelming favorites. And as I'm recording this yesterday, so I'm recording this on July 21st. On July 20th, the US had another one of their warm up games, and they were playing against South Sudan. And when you talk about a complete opposite setup between two teams or two countries, as it were, it really doesn't get more stark than the difference between US basketball and South Sudan basketball. South Sudan as a country is incredibly young, having come out of the civil war about a decade ago in the Sudan, which created this country, right? And you know, their basketball program is incredibly new. They actually still don't have indoor basketball facilities to practice in. Everything's outdoors. So this team is very much cobbled together. It's honestly incredibly impressive that they even made the Olympics, you know, considering, you know, a team like Slovenia, who employs Luka Doncic, one of the best players in the world, couldn't make it in, right? So, but South Sudan's in, and they gave the U.S. a game, right? The U.S. has all this talent and, you know, LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Anthony Edwards, all these great players. And, you know, South Sudan had a pretty big lead at one point, ends up not holding on and losing by one. But, you know, it showed that, you know, this team could hang with the big boys. And personally, I'm hoping that they do well in this tournament. I just feel like it's a great story, right? But it got me to thinking about rooting and how we root, why we root, and just the psychology of rooting for a successful team. So it's a little bit different when it comes to the idea of the Olympics and you're rooting for a national team. A lot of times patriotism is involved there, but I feel like as an NBA fan myself, and maybe other basketball fans can relate to this, is that you watch a lot of these players and you know you have an affinity or maybe a distaste for them one way or the other. You may hate Rudy Gobert, maybe that makes you not want to root for France. On the flip side, you may love Victor Wembanyama, maybe that does make you want to root for France. And then you get, like, if you're a Clippers fan and you've detested LeBron James since 2020, but you're also an American and you're going to root for the team, for Team USA, do you put that aside from to put the hatred of LeBron aside because he's now playing for your country, right? So I understand that complexity. But it's important, I think, to consider just how dominant this US team has been. There have been 20 Olympic games that have featured men's basketball. In 16 or 17 of them, the U.S. has come away with a gold medal. Only in 1980 did they not medal at all. Every other time it's been either a silver or a bronze medal, but you know, 16 gold medal performances out of 20 possible chances. So if you had a 20-year span in the NBA and I told you one team was going to win 16 times out of 20, you would be questioning the skill level and just the enjoyment of the league at that point, right? Like, why does this team keep on winning? But that is just an illustration of the talent disparity that has come with U.S. basketball. Again, the game really got popular here. It was really, even though it was invented by a Canadian, but was really honed in here, and as a result, the international dominance has come. Right now, we're probably in an era where that's more challenged than ever, but it is something that, you know, makes sense when you kind of put all those pieces together. But it got me to thinking, and I was messaging a friend of mine about this, and you know, we were talking about the South Sudan game, and you know how deep down, I found myself rooting for South Sudan to pull out the victory. One, it's of little consequence, right? It's just an exhibition game. It's a warm up game. It doesn't really mean anything if they win or lose, being the U.S. or South Sudan in that instance. But like the story of South Sudan, I found so interesting. Whereas, like, what's the story that I'm super interested about this U.S. team? It's an all-star team that, in theory, should win, and I think there is something to be said about that. Just not being an enjoyable product to watch. Back in the days, like when they assembled the Dream Team in 1992, that was, again, a bunch of tremendously talented American basketball players with the sole intention of winning. And I find my allegiances as an American, a person who lives in America, combating with my thirst and need for competition and my general detest of super loaded teams. To So it got me thinking even beyond that. How do people who root for these stacked deck teams, how do they do it, right? And so I'll use a couple examples from basketball, a couple examples from soccer, and even American football, because this happens a bit, right? So in basketball, I remember when after 2016 and the Warriors lost to the Cavs in the finals, they went ahead and acquired Kevin Durant. So at that point, I'll never forget this. When the free agency hit, I was at a Tim Hortons in Detroit and I was getting some coffee, and I saw that Kevin Durant had signed with the Warriors. And I was like, well, why are we even going to play the game next year? Well, why even play the season? It's just a foregone conclusion that the Cavs are coming out of the East and the Warriors are coming out of the West, and that the Warriors are probably going to win the whole thing. Sure enough, what happened? The Cavs came out of the East, the Warriors came out of the West, the Warriors won the title. And it's just and that was the case for 2 more years, right? Before the injuries and everything in Toronto 2019 happened, and then that dynasty or that iteration of the Warriors dynasty was broken up, right? And I just thought, how do you go about rooting for a team that is just expected to win all the time? Because if you're a team that doesn't have that expectation to always win, when you do win, it's an incredibly exciting moment. But when you lose, you know, it's devastating, but you could kind of glean some positives. Whereas if you're expected to win every single time, winning the title is a formality. Like, yeah, they did what they're supposed to do, versus losing is the biggest catastrophe, because you're not supposed to be in that situation to either ever be losing. You were assembled to win, right? So if you're rooting for the U.S. men's national team this summer, anything but the gold medal is a disappointment. And I just wonder, like, what is that like, right? It reminds me of like Manchester City in the Premier League. Like the years that they haven't won the Champions League or the years that they haven't won the Premier League, like what's that like for the fans of that team? And it's got to be weird, I think, if you're the fan of a team that used to be bad, like Manchester City, like the Warriors were before the Steph and Klay Thompson era, and then all of a sudden you're infused with all the success. If you're like an old school fan, how do you approach that? And I once saw an interview with a Manchester City supporter, and he was a fan of the team back in the 80s when they were just a football championship club. They weren't even in the Premier League yet, right? And then they get this influx of money, and all of a sudden they get Aguero and De Bruyne and all these great players. Pep Guardiola is just taking it to another level, and they're like, "Hey, this is our golden age. We're enjoying it." But I just wonder, like, how do your expectations change then? Like, if you're initially rooting for them to, maybe we could get into the Champions League, maybe we could do something in the FA Cup, and then that shifts into, well, if you don't win the Champions League, this season is a failure. How do you kind of reason with that? And what becomes acceptable as a fan? Like when I was living in Detroit, I was a season ticket holder for Detroit City FC, and they had just jumped into the United States League for soccer, USL, and Obviously that's a level below MLS. They were in NISA before that, which is another level below that. And they're like a middle of the table team. They weren't shitty, but they weren't amazing anyway, right? But so like every match was entertaining, important. Every match you would go and hope to see something great and hope that they could win a game. But if you're at the top flight and if you're just the best team around, like if you're in Italy and you're Juventus or Inter Milan, or if you're in France and it's PSG, and or even like in college football, if you're like Alabama or Georgia, like regular games just don't even mean anything. I feel like, right? Like nothing matters until you have the trophy, and I sometimes feel like that's not. I mean, it's not a super fun way to be a fan, right? And I think the reason for that is because now it could be just my experience as somebody who roots for teams that aren't that good, right? Like I've been a Knicks fan and a Giants fan for the longest time. The Giants right now have had probably, I think they have the worst record in the NFL since 2010, since the last time they won a Super Bowl. And I think the Knicks, while have recently gotten good, aren't really contending for titles yet, right? So I tend to value the climb more than anything, right? Being able to say, hey, look, we drafted well, we acquired free agents, whatever, we're building something. And that goes from, not making the playoffs. So maybe get into the first round to the second round and then finally break it through the conference finals and finally break it through the finals. In a weird way, even though the franchise has had tremendous success historically, this is what happened with the Celtics this past year. They've been steadily building ever since Tatum and Brown got drafted. And it's conference final, second round, conference final, finals, lost, and then eventually they figured it out. They got over the hump and they won. Regardless of whatever you want to say about the injuries that they faced during the East playoffs, the fact that they escaped playing Denver, whatever your opinion on that is, the fact is that those fans finally got over the hump after multiple years of getting so close and not quite getting there. And to me, that's infinitely more satisfying than, well, another year we won again, and I think like there's an arrogance that brews in the fan base when they're that successful. We saw it a lot in New England, where once the Brady stuff was over, they had to deal with, the Mac Jones era, right? Which wasn't great by any means. They were a middle of the road, below par team. And they're like, saying, oh, well, we deserve better than this. Well, this isn't the standard. Whereas what they're experiencing is a classic rebuilding situation. And, a lot of people are like, well, I don't have sympathy for them. They've been dominant for 20 years, which is, again, very true. And I think that when you're a fan of a team that's always expected to win, that's always expected to be on top, you end up kind of, numb to the joys of a regular game, right? You can't go like, let's say, you're a fan of a championship contending team in the NBA. You going to a game on a Friday night in January and watching a great player do great things is kind of rendered meaningless because you're like, yeah, it's cool, but wake me up when the playoffs come. In hockey, you saw this with the Detroit Red Wings for many years before, they bottomed out and they had their little playoff streak, right? They're like, yeah, it's cool. Wake me up till I get to the second round, right? Not even the first round. And I just feel like there's like a detachment that comes with all that success. And in some ways, maybe that's the benefit of parity that, if when no team is great and every team is just good, or most teams are just good, then you have more of the climb, more of the adversity to deal with. And it brought me again thinking about bandwagon fans, right? It's almost like a dirty word in sports. And you'll have a lot of journalists who'll say, I don't mind bandwagon fans because if I'm paying money for a team or to watch a sport, to buy merch, attend games, give them my time by watching them on TV and contributing to revenue ratings and all that, I should be watching a good product, right? And on a certain extent, I fully appreciate that. Like if your team that you follow is committing organizational malpractice, If your team is like the Washington Wizards or the Detroit Pistons are right now in the NBA, I totally understand checking out because there's organizational incompetence, right? But if you do have something to be excited about, I think that you should still, there is some value in that. Like even a team that's been kind of down in the dumps lately in the NBA, like the Charlotte Hornets, they haven't done much since in the way of getting to the playoffs since Kemba Walker left. And but now they have Brandon Miller, an exciting young prospect. They have LaMelo Ball, an exciting point guard that they just paid a max extension to. There is reason for excitement there, right? And again, they're building to get to the playoffs. And when it happens, there's going to be a rewarding feeling if the fans in Charlotte get to see a playoff game or series win. That yes, we drafted this guy, we watched him develop, we endured the mediocre seasons, and this is the payoff, right? Whereas like when you're on a bandwagon, like what's the payoff, right? So if you were the type of person who, yeah, I love LeBron James and the Miami Heat because they're so awesome, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, Kevin Durant's with the Warriors, that's my team now, and you see it like in football too, like people who jump all over the Chiefs bandwagon. Like if you're a fan of the Chiefs during the Trent Green era, right now you're in heaven because you're experiencing the golden years. But if you were just jumping from Tom Brady to Patrick Mahomes, I feel like at a certain point it becomes stale, right? Like, yeah, I'll just tune it in to watch them win again. It's almost like watching an episode of Law and Order in a weird way because when you're watching Law and Order, you generally know you're going to see a crime committed, the fact finding of the crime, and eventually the guy's going to get caught. Right, the perpetrator is going to get caught. It's part of the routine of the show, or like a TV show like House. Eventually the guy's going to get cured. Right, the person who's sick is going to get cured. House is going to figure it out in some miraculous way. That's part of the routine of that show. You know what you're getting. Is that what we want in sports, where we just jump from one great team to the next, and just to be able to celebrate on social media, on TikTok and Instagram, uh, the merits of our quote unquote fandom? I think there is something to having seen the bad side of the equation, the losing side of the equation, and thus making you appreciate it more. Which, in kind of wrapping it up, leads me to think again, it's like, is this even a healthy way to look at things? Like on one hand, anybody who's jumping from a bandwagon to a bandwagon is basically just saying, hey, I appreciate great football, basketball, soccer, whatever. I'm just watching the great players do their thing. And so for somebody like me to say, well, you're not dealing with the adversity and quote unquote paying your dues, I feel like maybe that's a toxic way to look at things, right? And I think that's kind of the issue with fandom in sports. They're obviously fan short for fanatic. Everybody knows that. The fanaticism of our teams and players, and it's almost like a sort of rite of passage that we kind of view like, well, you didn't experience it when we were losing, right? So how can you come aboard now? And generally, if there's like a bandwagon fan on a team that I'm rooting for that happens to be good, I have no issue with it. Like I've seen it with the Knicks this offseason after the Mikal Bridges acquisition. And people are like, yeah, I'm jumping on the Knicks bandwagon. I'm like, hey, hop aboard. There's more than enough room on this train car, right? But I do kind of wonder, like, what joy is derived there? Is it just the idea of watching a winning team night in, night out? And don't you kind of want to stick with that team after a while? Like, I'll use the Warriors again as an example. Let's say you jumped on a bandwagon back in 2015, right? You got to see them win titles. You saw them lose to LeBron in 2016, and you saw them lose to Kawhi in 2019. You watched Durant leave, but you still had Curry. You got another title in 2022, but now you're watching a team that's in the play-in. You're watching a team that just lost Klay Thompson, right? And so over this time, you've probably developed an affinity for Draymond Green and Steph Curry and Steve Kerr. And, this is, 8 years of fandom at this point. Are you just going to jump off to like Boston or Denver or Minnesota or whoever you want to jump onto next and not have a little bit of attachment to those players? Like these are your idols. These are people that you watch night in, night out religiously. for 8 years. Like, how do you just give that up, right? And it could be just like, hey, this is entertainment. I want to watch the most entertaining team, and I get that. But I sometimes feel like fandom should be more than that. Sports should be more than that, and it should be something that is, I guess, cherished in a weird way. And it's a complicated set of emotions because I also feel like if you're watching a team that has bad ownership or bad management, yeah, you should punish them by not giving them your attention. To use the Washington Wizards example, right? And so I kind of feel like ultimately, just kind of bringing this back to the Olympics, I find myself expecting the U.S. to win, but kind of really hoping some other teams scare them a little bit, right? Like I don't, I don't need to see a group of all stars win every game by 30. Like that's not entertaining to me, right? Like I'd love to see a drag out game between France and the US, and it comes down to like LeBron or Steph making a play at the end, right? Like that's good basketball to me. That's a good product to me. But ultimately it's just kind of a weird thing where like there's like this craving for demolition of success with this Olympic team. And I just find like rooting for them a little bit, not super exciting just because they're expected to win. And maybe it's because I've never been a fan of a team that expects to win a lot, right? Like in soccer, I've followed like Arsenal for many years. They haven't really done a lot since the 2000s, right? In college football, I root for West Virginia. They've never really won the national championship in my lifetime, so maybe this is just an indication of my fandom, but an indication of the teams I like to follow, the types of stories that I go after. But I just kind of wonder, if is winning ever enough when you are just watching teams that constantly dominate? When it becomes the expectation, how enjoyable is it really? So, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Luckily, on Spotify, we now have comments. So, if you have any comments about this, I'd love to hear them. But that's going to be another episode here of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also follow my written pieces on Medium at omarzaran.medium.com. My link tree is in the show notes, so you can follow me on all your favorite platforms. But until next time, we will see you guys later on another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast.